How do you paint all those rocks? Hi, welcome to Paint Coach. My name is Chris Fornatero and I'm here to help simplify oil painting so you can get better faster. Now, painting a big cluster of rocks is one of the most intimidating things to paint for any level of painter. I know I used to struggle with it so much, and I never understood how painters could just paint just all these rocks and all these details and these highlights and shadows, you know, and they'll paint it all in a plein air painting in one, 2 or 3 hour sitting. Like, how do you do that? How do you decipher like all the information that you're getting and put it onto a canvas? So now when I see like a big thing of rocks when I'm out plein air painting, I don't panic. So I took those specific things that I learned and I created a list of top 10 tips for painting rocks, which I'm going to go over today. Now, even though I'm talking about painting rocks, these tips can be applied to anything. Anytime you got a complex subject, it could be rocks, it could be logs, it could be bushes, whatever. What I'm going to be talking about in this video is going to be able to help you paint any complex, intricate subject. But before we get into that, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. You hitting that like button, it really helps the channel grow. If you want to see the full version of this rock painting tutorial, it is on my Patreon page, which you can find a link to in the description below. Also, when you sign up for the Patreon page, you will get access to my private Facebook group where you can post pictures of your own paintings. You can paint the rock paint and post a picture there and get advice from other people. You can give advice to other people. If you're struggling with the painting, you don't know what to do, you can post it to the Facebook page and get some help from painters that are learning just like you. And if you want to see what I paint on a daily basis, you can follow me on Instagram at Forza43. All right, on to tip number 1 for painting rocks. All right, tip number 1 is squint your eyes. This is very important, especially at the beginning. Even when you're drawing out the rocks, squint your eyes and just see the big shapes. You can see here that I'm not trying to draw every single rock. I'm just blocking in the entire mass of rocks and where they are on the canvas. All right, and tip number 2 is squint your eyes. Yes, this is going to be the most helpful thing I can ever say to you about painting complex subjects is squint your eyes. Squint your eyes, it's going to get rid of detail. You're just going to see light and dark. You're not even going to see that much color. And this is what I'm doing here. I'm just seeing the lights and the darks. I'm just seeing shapes here. I'm not even seeing objects. I'm grouping objects. I'm grouping rocks. I'm grouping parts of the rocks, even parts of water, sand, whatever. I'm grouping it together into lights and darks first. I'm actually using the same mixture of paint that I used to tone my canvas and draw in my subject, which is just ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. I'm not even worrying about color right now. I'm just worrying about mapping out the light and dark shapes. All right, tip number 3 is find your darkest darks early. You can see here that I'm still using that same ultramarine blue burnt sienna mixture, but I'm getting it dark enough and I'm indicating just the darkest darks that I can find in these rocks. And I'm not being super detailed or particular about it. I'm being pretty loose. But even though I am being loose, you can see that I'm already starting to kind of like dial in the general shape of the rocks. This is how we're going to eventually get to painting individual detailed rocks. We're going to sneak up on it. We're going to take it one shape at a time, and as we move along and get smaller and smaller with our shapes, we're going to reveal the rocks. We're going to identify shapes until the rocks emerge. Oh, the rocks are just going to emerge. Really, Chris? Don't you sound so artsy and sophisticated? All right, my next tip is when you block in the light areas, do with the darkest light that you can. You still want this to read as a light value, but if you start with the darkest light that you can, it will allow you to build lighter paint on top of that. And whenever you can, it's best to work dark to light. Now you want to work from dark to light, but you only want to work in dark to light within the lights and within the dark. So you want to work dark to light in the shadows and dark to light in the highlight areas. But my next piece of advice is bounce back and forth from shadows to highlights. In general, you want to be working the painting as a whole. And specifically with the rocks, you don't want to get too far in the shadows without going over to the highlights. You want to bounce back and forth and constantly compare one another. You can see here that I'm adding a cool blue in the shadows, but I'm not completely getting rid of the darkest darks that I laid down. But these darkest darks are small enough that I know I can go back in later and fill them in more. Then I go back to the lights and I dial in those values and colors a little bit more. All right, my next tip is be aware of your brush work. For this entire painting, I was using flat brushes. Now, if you want a beginner's brush guide that is all flat brushes, actually, you can check out my brush set, which is in a video, which I'll put a link to in the description above. No, I don't get any money from this brush company. I just thought it'd be helpful for beginners to give you the brushes I suggest that you use. And they happen to be all flats, which is what I'm using here. And flat brushes are great for painting rocks because they give you a very straight, rigid, strong stroke. You don't want very soft strokes here. You don't want soft edges because that's not going to read as a sturdy texture of a rock. You don't want curved strokes because rocks aren't curved. They're jagged, they're angular. And I think that you'll be amazed that when you get the stroke right, how much it reads as a rock. For a lot of these rocks in the background, I'm pretty much painting them with one simple stroke. All right, next tip is when you have a color for a rock, look to see if you can find that color in any of the other rocks. This will create color harmony within your rocks and make them all look like they're, part of the same group of rocks. I feel like a lot of time you get kind of zeroed in on individual rocks and there are different colors within each rock, but a lot of them share the same colors. If you paint one rock at a time till completion, it's very easy to have one rock looking completely different from another rock and they don't even look like they belong in the same set of rocks. All right, next tip is don't neglect what's going on around the rocks. When you're painting a landscape, make sure you're painting what's happening around the rocks because that's going to influence how you paint the rocks. For example, here, once I put in the white of the water, it made me realize I could go a lot lighter with the values in my rocks. So that's what I did. All right, next tip is don't worry about painting every single crack in the rocks. Just pick the major ones. And this, I'm just choosing the major cracks that I need to translate what I want. But I'm showing more cracks in detail in the rocks in the foreground opposed to the rocks in the background. This is going to help create depth. If you get a decent amount of detail and a few rocks in the foreground, it's going to go a long way in suggesting all the rocks that are behind it. Also be aware of atmospheric perspective with your rocks. If you have rocks like these that go back for a good distance, make sure the ones in the back don't have as much yellow or res, because remember atmospheric perspective, I'll put a link to my atmospheric perspective video above. As things get further away from you, the first color to drop out is yellow, then red, then you're left with blues. So you'll see a lot of the rocks, a lot of the highlights in the rocks in the back of this painting tend to be more red than yellow, and the shadows tend to be more cool, more blue, and more white. All right, and the last tip is, while you're working with all these different colors and values within the shadows and the highlights, and make sure everything's working in the right value. You're gonna see a lot of highlights in these shadows, a lot of lighter tones in the shadows, but make sure you don't make them too bright. Always be stepping back, looking at your painting, squinting your eyes, taking it in as a whole, and being aware if you make something too bright, say in the shadows. It's very easy for this to happen. It's towards the end of the painting, you're doing details, you're looking, you're seeing these cool, highlights happening in the shadows, these lighter values, and you start painting them, and you realize that you paint them just as bright as the highlights, and now they look like highlights, but then the shadows, and everything's getting confusing, and you've lost that basic structure that you laid out in the beginning of just light and dark shapes. We want to keep that through the whole painting. That's going to help you paint these rocks as some all in the shadows, some are in the light, but if those shadows and highlights aren't working, it's just going to be a big jumbled mess. All right, so I hope you're less afraid of painting rocks now. If you want to see the full version of this painting video tutorial, you can find that on my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. If you want to see what I'm painting on a daily basis, you can follow me on Instagram at Forza43. If you have a question that you want answered during my Paint Talk Q&A videos that come out every Friday, leave that question in the comment section of this video, and I just might answer it on Paint Talk. I am Chris Fornataro, here telling you to go get painting. Whoa, you're still here. You made it to the end of the video. That must mean you really like it. In that case, you should hit the subscribe button. You'd also probably like this video too. And this video. Please pick one. All right, this is getting awkward.